Hello everyone, welcome back to my Form 5 Ethics class at St. Anselm's Abbey School. In this video, we're going to take a look at question 19, Article 1, but before we do that, I want to say a few things about question 19 in general and the way it relates to question 18. In question 18, Aquinas gives the three parts of any voluntary action that must be good for the action to be good. An action has to be good in terms of what is done, or the thing that is done, why that thing is done, and the circumstances around the doing, the object, the end, and the circumstances, Articles 2, 3, and 4. And then we spend a lot of time reading the different ways in which those interact and give us species and things like that. Now in question 19, we begin with something that looks like a little bit of a repetition. Now, instead of looking at any voluntary action, we're going to look at the act of the will, that interior action that makes those actions be voluntary. But it is an act. The act of the will is an action, so it seems like we should get the exact same treatment. We should still care about the object, the end, and the circumstances. And when Aquinas starts this question, it looks like that's what he's going to do. He begins by talking about the object. Now, instead of talking about a thing done, we'll be talking about a thing willed, and we'll talk about why it's willed and the circumstances around the willing. It turns out that's not the way question 19 goes at all. If it did, then question 19 would be a little pointless. Instead, after the first article, we take a sort of sudden veering off the road and look at all of the things that I would consider the heart of Aquinas' ethics. Lots of future ethics will just begin here after Aquinas, rather than doing all that spade work in things with voluntary action and practical reason. We'll just begin here with question 19. We're finally going to get a look at measuring the action. Measuring an action as good or evil. What it means to be in accord with reason. Take the first steps on that. And we're also going to take a very significant step in terms of bringing in revelation. Everything Aquinas has said so far in this course has been a natural ethics. It's something that he could have argued about with Aristotle or with Cicero, with anybody. We haven't ever used theological premises, revelation. Sometimes we've brought them up as objections or as sed contras, but they've never been important premises in arguments. Now, however, we want to make that connection. We want to show how we go from just using our best judgment to depending on revelation. And that means faith and reason working together for ethics. So from this point on, we will be able to talk about a properly Christian or Catholic ethics. And for this course, our culminating treatment will be in Articles 5 and 6, where Aquinas talks about conscience. Gives a very famous account of what conscience is and how it works. And we'll end the course there for the semester, although it's possible we'll make videos on some of the later articles. Those later articles in question 19 are important, but I think that the core of them is found in Articles 5 and 6. So we'll stop it there. So let's look at Article 1, where it appears we're going to do our parallel program with question 18. The goodness or malice of the act of the will and how it relates to the object. You should recognize the objections, or at least the gist of them, pretty easily. We're only going to look at the first one. The second objection is quite involved and doesn't really give us anything directly helpful for what we're talking about right now. It's mostly an interpretation of a passage in the Nicomachean Ethics and trying to work out something that Aquinas talked about earlier. If we wanted to relate it back to earlier questions in this volume, we could, but it's not very practically useful for getting a handle on question 19. We will look at the reply to 1 and 3 because they should be familiar to you. So objection 1. It would seem that the goodness of the will does not depend on the object, for the will cannot be directed at anything other than what is good, since evil is outside the scope of the will, and we're going to quote Dionysius on the divine names yet again, not for the last time. If therefore the goodness of the will depended on the object, it would follow that every act of the will is good and none bad. We've been seeing this since question 8, Article 1. Well, you already know the answer to this. You don't need me to show you the reply. I will quickly run through it when we get there. But as your own student check, you should already know how to answer that. I do want to draw your attention to one other thing, though. the conclusion that the objector draws here is strictly speaking an overreach. It's a logical overreach. All those premises really prove is that the goodness of the will can't depend on the object alone, meaning you could get an act of the will that is bad by something other than the object. All it proves is it can't be bad by the object. Because of something we're going to say pretty soon, that ends up not mattering. So in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter that this objector overreaches, but you should recognize a logical overreach when you see it. All he's really proving is that the will can't be bad by its object. Maybe it can be bad by something else. It cannot. Into the Sed Contra. And I think we'll spend a few minutes on this one. This requires a little bit of explanation. The philosopher says, in the Nicomachean Ethics, that justice is that habit from which humans wish for good things, and accordingly, virtue is a habit from which humans wish for good things. But a good will is one which is in accord with virtue, therefore the goodness of the will is from the fact that a human wishes that which is good, or wills that which is good. Now, every other time habit has shown up, either in an objection or in a Sed Contra, I've gone on a rant in these videos about how we shouldn't be looking at that yet, because Aquinas hasn't talked about habit in the Summa yet, and we don't know what that is. And so it seems like we should do the same thing here. However, it's not quite as bad. The main reason I think that this one doesn't trouble me quite as much is that, first of all, Aquinas doesn't use the word habit here. That's the English translator throwing that word in. The actual Latin for virtue as a habit from which humans or men wish for good things is virtus est secundum quam aliqui volunt bona. Virtue is that according to which some will goods. So it is true that Aquinas thinks of virtue as a habit. And so it's not a false claim, but he doesn't actually say habit here. That's one reason it doesn't bother me quite as much. But also, this is a pretty reasonable quotation and explanation of what Aristotle is saying in the Nicomachean Ethics. I think the translator is wrongly giving you the impression with those quotation marks that the quotation from Ethics is quite narrow, the from which men wish for just things, when in fact the entire first half of the Sed Contra, and arguably all of it, is just what Aristotle's talking about in Nicomachean Ethics. It's Aristotle himself who says that justice is virtue entire. He makes the link explicit in that text that Aquinas is citing. So really the whole thing is an Aristotelian quotation. It's a little bit of an interpretation or maybe a steering of what Aristotle's doing there, taking it in a slightly different direction. But it's very reasonably just, well, Aristotle does talk about justice and virtue and wanting good things. The new issue for us here is this claim about a good will is one which is in accord with virtue. We do still need to know what that means beyond just an Aristotelian quotation. Aquinas does still need, in the next volume of the Summa, to get into what we mean by virtue. But assuming that's close enough for now, assuming we're just invoking Aristotle to get started for the Respondeo, this one's not too bad. Of all of the habit invocations that we've seen, or the virtue invocations that we've seen, this one bothers me the least. So as long as you have the idea that a good will is one which is in accord with virtue, this Sed Contra works fine. The Respondeo is quite easy. And before we look at the indented text on the right, I just want to read the first and the last lines on this slide. Good and evil are essential differences of the act of the will. We're going to skip why. We'll skip that for a second. We'll come back to it. Consequently, good and evil will are acts differing in species. You should recognize that from question 18, Article 2, Article 5, 6, and 7. All of the specification work we did in question 18. You should already know what comes next after this on the next slide. If good and evil are essential differences of the act of the will, then good and evil acts of the will are acts differing in species, and it's the object that specifies. So the only new thing in this article, in this Respondeo, is the indented part. Why is it that good and evil are essential differences of the act of the will? Well, because good and evil of themselves regard the will, just as true and false regard reason, the act of which is divided essentially by the difference of true and false, for as much as an opinion is said to be true or false. It's interesting that he doesn't just say, well, in question 18, voluntary action is divided essentially into good and evil. Right? This is just question 18 again, Article 5, Article 6. So it seems like he could say it's just as true here with the act of the will as it is in question 18 with any voluntary action, right? Those differ essentially by good and evil, so this one does too. And the reason he doesn't say that is because it's more true with the act of the will than it is with voluntary action, more broadly speaking. This is where it is first true and most importantly true. And you already know the reason why. It's the convertibility of transcendentals again. Good and evil pertain to the will of themselves. A little closer to the Latin, per se ad voluntatem pertinent. Good is a will word. The first line of the convertibility argument. The good is what all desire. The starter meaning of goodness, of good, is that it's wanted or wantable. It pertains to an appetite. Well, the will is an appetite. The will is the rational appetite. Moral good and evil are most said of the rational appetite, of the will. The other interesting thing to say here is the way it compares to the intellect. We've never really worked with this much, not even in Form 3. We said a little bit about it then. But he's actually running another convertibility argument here. Good and evil are first said of the will, just as true and false are first said of the intellect. You can run an argument for the convertibility of being and true, and it will almost perfectly parallel the argument that we do for being and goodness. That just as good first means that we want it, and then from there we get up into all these other senses of good, the objective sense of goodness, the same is true for the word true. That, well, first we think it. It's first our own judgment, that S is P. And from there, we get into other senses of the word true, the more objective senses. So it's nice to see the harmony of the convertibilities here. And also, obviously, because we're going to make a big deal out of the role of reason, he's showing some sort of connection here that we might exploit down the road. Well, just to close the loop on all of this, if you read question 18, you already know the answer to this. This is why question 19 looks exactly the same as question 18 at first. The specific difference of acts is according to object, as stated above. So good and evil in the act of the will is derived properly from the object. And we've just summarized it over here on the right in the box. Good and evil are essential differences of the act of the will. Good and evil acts of the will are acts differing in species. Specification is by object, so it's the object that makes the act of the will good or evil. What we will, the thing that we will, makes our act of the will good or bad. Very easy. Why don't we go on to do the same with everything else? That's the next article. Before we look at that, we'll just clean up the replies. The answer to the first objection is trivial. You should check your own notes. Where's the first time we ever talked about this? The will is not always directed to what is truly good, but sometimes to the apparent good, which has indeed some measure of good, but not of a good that is simply suitable to be desired. Hence it is that the act of the will is not always good, sometimes evil. Apprehended goods or apparent goods show up again and again and again. It's not the object as it exists in itself, it's the object as it exists in the reason. And that's why the reply to objection 3 is also helpful. Good is presented to the will as its object by the reason. And insofar as it is in accord with reason, it enters the moral order and causes moral goodness in the act of the will, because reason is the principle of human and moral acts, as stated above. So back to question 18 again. But we've been saying that good is presented to the will as its object by the reason for a lot longer than that. For how long have we, in this class, been talking about the intellect proposing the object to the will? When did we first do that? It's been a while. But with those two very easy reminders done, the article's done. Question 19, Article 1 is very easy, and we don't need to dwell on it too much. The fun part is what comes next. And we're going to do that in another video because Article 2 is going to take some work. So if you have any questions on this video, I hope that you do not. But if you do, you know how to get a hold of me. And in the meantime, good luck with your studying, and God bless.